Very, very relieved with that. So have your Bibles open with me to 1 Timothy 5. We're going to finish up a section here that Paul is writing to Timothy, who is stationed in Ephesus, and Timothy is taking care of the day-to-day business in Ephesus. And he's setting some things straight that had been messed up within that church. They had gone wrong in some areas. And so Paul has given him some instructions, some commandments here on how to do some things. Give him some principles as well. And so this whole section that we're looking at from verses 3 through verse 16, we already covered through verse 8. But we need to review those just to get back in the context. And the whole subject here is on the dealing with widows within the church. We know that if we're going to be in the will of God, we have to take care of widows. You see that in the Old Testament over and over. God's concern for those who are helpless, anyone who's helpless, widows, orphans. And then you get into the New Testament, and as soon as the church is started in Acts chapter 6, widows become a big priority. We have to take care of the widows. And so Paul is helping Timothy understand how to do this. And it's not on sentimental things. It's not on emotional draws. It's not having a bleeding heart for every sob story that comes along. There are real ways. There's people who need the help of the church. There's people who don't. And so verse 3, he starts off there and he says, I just want to review these verses quickly before we get to 9 through 16. He says, honor widows that are widows indeed. All right, so this word honor is to support. It means to attach a monetary value. You help them in the way that they need, but just the ones that he's saying that are widows indeed. That's his way of saying there's some that don't need your support. You need to be discerning about this. And so he's warning Timothy that the church has an obligation to some widows, but not to others, not just anybody who's lost their husband. In verse 4, he goes on, and he shows, he says, but if any widow have children or nephews, that nephews means grandchildren, let them learn first to show piety at home and to requite their parents, for that is good and acceptable before God. So if a widow has adult children or grandchildren, he's saying they should be taken care of by those children and grandchildren, and you should encourage those children and grandchildren to do that. And I want to bring attention to this word piety, showing piety at home. That word piety has a double meaning. It means worship toward God, and it means respect toward parents. Now what that means is that you can't claim to be worshiping God and at the same time tell your aging mother or father, well, you're on your own. That can't be done. Now that doesn't mean that every person who is taking care of an elderly mother or father is a Christian. I want to say that. But these two things can't be separated. You can't say you are in the will of God if you're not taking care of your aging parents. Okay, so I want to clear up something that I felt like I wasn't clear enough about when we were here a few weeks ago. I want to be clear that there are situations where a widow has unbelieving kids who refuse to take care of them. In that case, the church has the obligation, and I want to say the church has the privilege of caring for those widows. We know this, that Jesus talks about in Matthew 10, that the gospel will divide families at times. He says, don't think that I come to bring peace, I bring a sword. It's going to divide families. He said your foes will be those of your own house. You have the mother against the mother-in-law, and daughter against daughter-in-law, and son against father, and so forth. So we know that there are times where people are just not going to get along because here is mom and she's going to follow Christ no matter what, and they just don't want a part of that. In that case, church takes care of them. Okay, so moving on in that next thing, it says now he's been saying, you honor widows who are widows indeed. What is a widow indeed? Who are the ones who we're supposed to honor? Verse 5. Now, she that is a widow indeed and desolate, trusteth in God and continueth in supplications and prayers night and day. So the desolate is talking about she's totally without supporting family. She doesn't have anybody else. There's nobody to fall back on. There's no kids, no grandkids to help. And here's the biggest part is she's continuing in supplications and prayers night and day. She is dependent upon God, period. She's not leaning to her own understanding. She's not trying to go out and figure out how she's going to get it done on her own. She says, God, you're going to take care of me, and I trust you for it. And the church says, yes, he is. We're going to make sure you're taken care of. Okay, that's a widow indeed. Now, verse 6 gives the opposite of the widow indeed. This is the one that's not supposed to be supported. But she that liveth in pleasure is dead while she liveth. Now, living in pleasure is talking about a person who just says, I'm going to milk all the fun I can out of this life. I'm going to get all I can all I can get. And I'm just going to enjoy all the fun I can. And that's all I care about. At any cost, that's what I'm going to do. And so basically they love the world more than they love Christ. He says that's not a widow indeed. All right, and it says she's dead while she liveth, meaning she's spiritually dead. She's unsaved. That person is. Verse 7 goes on. Verse 6 will become a little clearer with what we're talking about tonight. Verse 7, and these things give in charge, that they may be blameless. So Paul is saying, I'm commanding you to follow these principles. Do you get that? This is a command to follow principles. These are not commands because there's so many different situations. You show me 10 different people and there'll be 10 different situations. Okay, so what has to happen is the elders that we just voted for, it's their responsibility to figure out and weigh each situation and use discernment and wisdom to see what needs to happen, how it needs to be taken care of. Okay, but these are principles. But he's saying you have to follow these principles. This is a job that has to get done. And it keeps the church blameless. It says, give these things in charge that they may be blameless. Basically, if you follow these principles, it keeps the church above reproach. Nobody's able to look at the church and say, you know that woman you're supporting? You ought to see what she's out doing. You ought to see what she goes out and gossips, talks about, that kind of thing. Basically, here's what this does. This is a protection for the church. It keeps the church from supporting a woman who is actually an unbeliever. It keeps the unbeliever from becoming the face of the church to the community and therefore bringing reproach to the name of Christ. Now, it holds the elders of the church accountable to thinking rationally about who receives support and not just giving out support based on emotions and sentimentality. Not just because, oh, we know this person and she seems nice. And no, you have to dig in and see, okay, what's the actual need? What is the situation fully here? So the last thing, verse 8, we left off of this verse last time. It says, but if any provide not for his own, and especially of those of his own house, he hath denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. He's saying even the heathen, even the pagans take care of their parents. He's saying that if a person won't care for their own mothers, grandmothers, parents, he's saying they're not saved. This is a manifestation of the fruit of the Spirit. You'll know them by their fruits. He says if a person won't take care of their parents, they're not a Christian. Okay? So what we're going to look at tonight is 9 through 16. And it shows us who the church is supposed to support and who they're not. And so he goes on with this thought, and he digs deeper. He gives some more explanation for why this is so important. Explains a little further. We'll see this, that we'll see the damage that can occur to individuals and to churches if a church neglects this duty. Specifically, if elders neglect this duty. It's their job. I want to point this out. Look at verse 1, chapter 5, verse 1. He says, rebuke not an elder, but entreat him as a father. So he starts into talking about elders, but it's almost like he goes, oh, wait a minute, one more thing before we dig into that. And when he gets back to verse 17, he says, let the elders that rule well be counted worthy. So he goes back to this subject of elders. This is given within the subject of elders. He's saying this is an elder's job to make sure this is done. Get this, Timothy is an head elder at Ephesus. And he is the one who's be in charge of making sure this happens. This is very important. Now, one other thing we'll see tonight is that the handling of widows says a lot about an individual's spiritual condition, and it says a lot about a church's spiritual condition. How a church loves on their widows and their helpless, the ones who really need help. So let's dig in here in verse 9 and 10 And what I want you to see in these verses, these two verses, is that a woman, this is a woman who is not, now get this woman is not to receive permanent support from the church. Get those two words, not and permanent. Not to receive permanent support from the church. Verse 9. Let not a widow be taken into the number under 60 years old, that's 60, having been the wife of one man, well reported of for good works, if she have brought up children, if she have lodged strangers, if she have washed the saints' feet, if she have relieved the afflicted, if she have diligently followed every good work. So get this. To really understand what we're talking about, we had to dig into the historical context. What's Paul saying to Timothy in this moment? When he says the number in verse 9, let not the widow be taken into the number, he's talking about a specific group of widows. And here's what they'd done. This specific group had made a vow to God. And they were going to serve the church. This is their vow. They're going to serve the church permanently. And they're going to serve with the ability they have and with any time they have left on this earth. And they're not going to get remarried. That's their vow. They're going to take the time they have left. They're not going to get married. They're giving all their time and effort to the church. Okay? Now, this is particularly needful in Paul's time because of the culture. Okay? Men and women in the first century were kept extremely separated. They did not mix together. A man could not go, a deacon was not going to be able to go to a woman's home for any reason. If she's in there, he can't go in. Okay, so the woman had to go in and do these things, whatever it needed to be done in this woman's house. Okay, the other reason this is so important, this crowd of women is so important, is because there was almost no opportunity in the first century for women to make their own money. They didn't go out and have jobs and start businesses. That's not how it worked. Let's make sure we get this real quick. These are not nuns. All right? This is not a permanent situation. This is not young women going to do this. In fact, Paul says the young women need to get married. So these are not nuns. This is not a monastery. This is not something Catholic. The Catholics couldn't use this for a verse to say, see, this is nuns. It's not at all. Because nuns don't get married. Paul's saying, I'd rather they just get married. Okay, this is not a mandated group within the church. This is not like God says you need elders, you need deacons. He didn't say you need to have this number. Okay, so what we have to understand is we are gleaning examples. We're gleaning principles here. What we need to use within our culture to get the things done God says to do. Okay, how do we take care of widows? That's what we're looking at. So get this. The woman described in verses 9 and 10 is not eligible for this number, for this group. She's not eligible. Now, let's make sure we understand what we're saying. If she's under 60, under 60 years, that's 60, she's not eligible. It says if she's been the wife of one man, that literally means a one-man woman. She's been a faithful wife. Now, she could have had 3 husbands die. Doesn't mean she's only had one husband. It means she's a faithful wife. She has a reputation for that. Now, verse 5. She's a reputation for good works. This woman, remember, she's not supposed to come into this number. If she's brought up children, if she's lodged strangers, that she's hospitable. And when it says wash the saints' feet, that doesn't mean literally. She might not have literally done that. But what it means is she has a servant's heart, and it comes out in her actions. She's humble. She'll do whatever it takes to serve in whatever capacity she needs to. Okay? And it says if she's relieved the afflicted, diligently followed every good work. Basically, she's the heart of a servant. Okay? So here's the deal. Now listen. That woman, the first line of verse 9, let not a widow be taken into the number. Let not. That woman is not to be allowed to take this vow to be permanently supported by the church. Now, at first glance, I'm reading that going, am I reading that right? Because this woman sounds like a winner. This sounds like this woman is doing exactly what she's supposed to be doing. And if anybody needs to be allowed into this number, it's this woman because she's got it all going the right way. And that's the point. What Paul's saying is she's a catch. He's saying she's obviously meant to be a wife and mother. God has built that into her. He's saying she has a work history you can look at and say, yeah, she's good at that. All right, so the situation, here's what Paul's guarding against. Here's a problem that would arise if you were to take a 30 or 40-year-old woman or a 50-year-old woman and put her in this number when her husband dies. Here's what Paul's guarding against. Is a woman, and he's guarding the church as well, a young woman who loses her husband. But she's obviously meant to be a wife and mother. But in the grief and the emotions of the moment of losing her husband, it leads her to make an unwise decision that she will eventually resent with the passing of time. Give it a few years, and that grief is wearing off, and she's still a young woman. She still has those desires to be a wife and mother. Paul says, don't put that woman under some kind of vow. Don't let her take this vow. Once the grief and emotions subside, this woman will want to live the life that God created her for. Now, let's make sure we get this. That also is not to say that a 59-year-old woman is likely to have kids. She's not. Okay, but she can still be a great stepmother, a great step-grandmother, or adopted mother, or foster mother. She can be a great manager of the home. She can just be a great helpmeet to her husband. She can still do that. And listen, he's not saying if she's over 60 that's a hard rule. Obviously, if she's over 60, she can still go do this. That's still okay. But his number was 60. Okay, so let's move on and dig into why is this? Why is Paul making this case? Don't let this woman who's like this come into this number where they take this vow. 11 and 12 go on to explain a little more of the why these women were not to be permanently supported by the church. I say not permanently because they can be supported for a little while, temporarily. That would be absolutely right for the church to say, okay, you're in need right now. Let's just take care of you for a little while. Okay, so look here. I want to say these verses have strong language. It seems like Paul is being rough, but what he's saying he's not. He's being very practical. It's just the way it translates in English, it can come across as really rough language. Verse 11 and 12, it says, "But the younger widows refuse, for when they have begun to wax wanton against Christ, they will marry, having damnation, because they cast off their first faith." Okay, so this could have happened, and this might have happened where a woman made this vow and now she's unhappy. And Paul's saying, guard them against that. Okay, but really this is probably a hypothetical situation where there's a woman, she's made this vow from the place of an emotional grieving place, and now the emotions have worn off. So now the vows to live single and to live off of the meager support the church would give sounds more like a prison sentence to this woman. Now she's in this position where the grief has worn off, and she's still in this position that she's not really made to be in. And so he's saying, don't let her get in that spot. So what happens is, it says she gets married. She just acts like she didn't make the vow, and she goes and gets married. So she breaks the vow, gets married. I want to point this out, that in the Jewish culture, for the Jewish law, the Old Testament law, the husband was allowed to void his wife's vow. If he finds out that his wife has made a vow, the husband had every right to say, you're not making that vow. And God said, she's not under that vow. That was perfectly legal in God's eyes. So get this, obviously there's no husband here to stop her, is there? In this situation, her husband just died. Her husband's not going to say, nope, can't make that vow. So what he's saying is, it's the elders of the church's job to stop her. It's their job to say, nope, you can't do that. We're not going to let you come into this. We're not going to let you make that vow. Jesus says it's better not to make a vow than to make one and break it. When you make a vow, God says, you're going to have to keep that. Okay, so So in verse 12, again, it's strong language, right? So she gets married in spite of this vow. Wanting against Christ just means, okay, she wants to be a wife and mother more than she wants to serve Christ. Okay, and then if she gets married in that case, it says having damnation, meaning having judgment. God looks at her and says, you're living in sin. It doesn't mean she's lost her salvation. It doesn't mean she was never saved. What it means is this: the woman has made some commitments to Christ and has broken them. This is not a situation where she has had a weak moment and now she can repent and she's back in good relationship with God. She has made a choice to live every single day in rebellion, really to her vow and to Christ. So she's made that commitment and broken it. To get married at this point means she'd be living in sin. Now you go on, verse 13 gives the opposite reaction. Okay, so this is a woman who says, I've made this vow, I'm unhappy in it, I'm going to get married anyway. What if she says, I've made this vow, I'm unhappy in it, and I'm just going to deal with it? Again, she wasn't supposed to be able to make that vow if she fit these descriptions. Verse 13 says, this is the woman who doesn't get married. And withal, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but tattlers also and busybodies, speaking things which they ought not. So this woman stays single well enough. She doesn't get married. She keeps her vow, but she becomes increasingly more sinful. Now listen, because she's not in the role God built her for. Now we could apply that to all of us. God has created all of us for such a time as this. He has given us a particular place to be and a role to serve within His church, within our family. And if we get out of that role, it's just going to become more and more hard to follow Christ. We're going to be more and more sinful. And she winds up a person who has a lot of time on her hands. She doesn't have a wife and kids to care for. God didn't call her to something else. She's discontent doing anything else. And now her job is to sort of be a deaconess, and she's going around from house to house. Instead of helping folks, it's just a reason to go around and gossip. She's just spreading rumors and lies and just being a problem. And so this could be the woman from verse 6. Remember verse 6, but she that liveth in pleasure is dead while she liveth. This could be a woman who is just not born again, and she says, you know what, this is a pretty good, I'm on the meal ticket here. I'm just going to live it up and enjoy it. Instead of being a great benefit to the church, which is what this order of women was, she becomes a reproach to Christ. She becomes a problem. She becomes sort of leaven within the bread, you could say. So, verse 14 through 16 sums up this section and kind of sums up God's will for most believers concerning widows. Again, these are principles. And so we're to apply these principles to each one of us. How does this fit for you? Okay, so verse 14. He says, I will therefore that the younger women marry, bear children, guide the house. So he's talking to younger women who may have become widows. He's talking to young women, period. And he says, now let me make this statement. I want you to listen close, all right? Most young women, I said most, not all. Most young women are to get married and serve God by loving their husbands and their kids. God made them for that. It's not all. God have different callings for different people. Look at the second half of this verse. Starting there, it says, give none occasion to the adversary to speak reproachfully. So if a woman gets married, bears children, guides the house, she gives none occasion to the adversary to speak reproachfully. Basically, she's busy doing what she's supposed to be doing, and it keeps her from going and doing what she's not supposed to be doing. There's something to be said for that, isn't there? They say the idle hands to the devil's workshop. It's very true. And so this happens any time for any Christian when we lean to our own understanding, when it's making choices, when we're making choices, and instead of prayerfully seeking God's will from His Word. There is a lot of protection in Jesus' light and easy yoke. When He says, follow me, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. If we wiggle out of that yoke and we're doing something else, something that's not His will. It might be nice stuff, but if it's not His will for our lives, we lose our protection. We're out in the open. We're very seriously in danger. We're about to get in trouble. And when we talk about the adversary, we have to understand that's not just talking about Satan. That's talking about all of Satan's tools. It's talking about his whole world system. You understand, any of the enemy of the gospel is who this is talking about. That's the adversary. Understand that in this situation, if a woman calls herself a Christian and she is being supported by the church and everybody knows that she's living off the church, she's supposed to be going around helping church folks, and all she does is going around like this, making trouble, and so in discord among the brethren, the whole of Satan's army looks at that and says, see, ain't nothing to that Christianity thing. They're all just like everybody else. Just all a bunch of heathen. Same thing when you see stuff on the news about preachers falling. Same thing when you see any Christian that is acting like an unbeliever, and unbelievers love to say, see, told you wasn't nothing to it. He says, don't give Satan that opportunity. Okay, verse 15. He says, for some are already turned aside after Satan. This is talking about the false converts who love this world more than Christ. These are talking about there must be a few women or one or two women, and Paul's saying, listen, Timothy, this has already happened. You got to stop this. You got to stop this trend, and don't let a woman who fits that category, don't let them take this vow, because they're going to sign up for something they're never meant to be, never meant to do. Protect them from that, Timothy, is what he's saying. And here's the thing, there's people who, when these difficult situations come along, that's when it shows what they really are. When anything difficult comes along, it shows what we are, doesn't it? And that's what's happening with these ladies in this situation. All right, verse 16 is really talking to anybody when it comes to dealing with how we treat our widows. He says, if any man or woman that believeth have widows, let them relieve them, and not the church be charged. Let not the church be charged, that it may relieve them that are widows indeed. So he's saying the church needs to save its funds for the ones that are actually in need of the help. He says if they have family, let the family take care of them. You tell the family to take care of them. So in a sense, this is really just restating verse 8. Remember verse 8, if any provide not for his own, especially for those of his own house, he hath denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. Here is the responsibility of the church. The church is to teach its members to take care of their parents and grandparents. And surely we wouldn't have to push too hard to get true Christians to do that. He says even the infidels do that. And the church is to hold people accountable to actually doing it. It's not enough just to say, well, yeah, I love my mom and dad. It's not enough to write a check, put them somewhere and outsource that. That's hopefully not what your mom did when you were an infant. It's saying take care of these who've taken care of you. Take care of your own. Take care of your elderly. Love on them. All right, so I got 3 thoughts I want to leave with you for this section from verses 3 through 16. And I think they're very fundamental for how we're to love on one another, handle widows, handle people who are helpless in that sense. Number 1 is this. Most, again I emphasize most, not all. Most women were created with a nurturing, mothering bent. That's how God created them. Therefore, since they have that, most women should order their life to do those things. We've been told our culture says, listen, you can be anything you want to be. Yeah, maybe. But you don't want to be that. You want to be what God wants you to be. God has created you for a time as this and for a purpose. We have to acknowledge that even within the church, the feminist movement of the past 50 plus years have really gotten its hooks in our culture. And so what's happened is too many women in our culture, too many people think that being a wife and a mother is like doing nothing with your life. They'll say, well, that's just a waste. That's the thought. They'll say, yeah, but you don't work? You don't have a career? Understand, according to the Bible, a wife and a mother is one of the highest callings you can have. I read a story, a short little story that I want to read to you as I was studying for this verse, and this really touched me, and I hope it will you as well. It illustrates this very well. This is the story of a Scottish preacher named Ian McLaren, and he's having a conversation. He's recording a conversation he had with an elderly woman in his church. And I'll spare you the Scottish accent, but see if I can just read this to you. It says, as they were talking, she began to wipe her eyes with the corner of her apron. So Dr. McLaren said, what's disturbing you? Oh, she said, sometimes I feel I have done so little, and when I think about it, it makes my heart heavy, because really I've done so little for Jesus. When I was a wee girl, the Lord spoke to my heart and I surrendered to Him. And I wanted to live for Him oh so much, but I feel I haven't done anything. What have you done with your life? The preacher asked. Oh, nothing, she said, just nothing. I've washed dishes, cooked 3 meals a day, taken care of my children, mopped the floor, mended the clothes. You know, everything a mother does. That's all I've done. McLaren sat back in his chair and asked, where are your boys now? Oh, she spoke, you know, I named them after the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You know them all. You know where Mark is. You ordained him. He went to China. He's learned the language, and now he's able to minister to the people in the name of the Lord. And where's Luke? McLaren said. You know well enough where he is, because you sent him out. I had a letter from him the other day. He's in Africa and says a revival has broken out at his mission station. And Matthew, he asked. He's with his brother in China, and they're working together. And John, who's 19, came to me last night to say that God has laid Africa on his heart. He said, I'm going to Africa, but don't worry about it, Mother, because the Lord has shown me that I am to stay with you until you go home to glory. Then I'll go. Until then, I have to take care of you. McLaren looked at the elderly saint and said, your life has been wasted, you say? Yes, it's been wasted, she said. The preacher said, you have been cooking and mopping and washing, but I would like to see the reward when you're called home. I just think that hit me so hard when I read that, because the lady's thoughts were what so many people think of today. When they think, I'm just a wife and mother. I'm just cooking and cleaning. What good's that? God says it's worth everything. I mean, her 4 boys had went off, and they're winning souls. Somebody had to train those kids up to do that. And Mom was the one. She's got a lot of rewards waiting on her. She multiplied herself 4 times. Praise God. Let me just say this, leaving that first point. If God has given you a husband and kids, that is your ministry. There's a lot of nice things that people can get involved in, but for a mother who has a wife or has a husband and kids, that's her ministry. It's where God wants her. Here's the second thing. Next 2 are shorter. It's dangerous for any person to live outside of their God-given role and with too much idle time. That's what these women wound up in, who took this vow prematurely, hastily, in emotion, and they wound up with too much idle time. They wound up outside of their God-given role. That's a dangerous place, whether you're a woman or a man. Last thing, number 3, how a Christian handles widows and how a widow handles her own situation says a lot about their spiritual state. Paul equates it with salvation so many times through this section. We think of things like this and they're very practical, and we tend to divorce them from the spiritual, but we can't do that. Paul says that there's no such thing as doing that. Every problem is a spiritual problem. Understand that what we're talking about here, these principles that he's given, applying them to our lives is the separated Christian life. We think of what does it mean to come out from among them and be ye separate? It's these little things. It's how do we love on one another? You know, Miss D, you're thanking everybody for helping you. We're just looking for the opportunity. We can't wait to help somebody. Josh told me, he said, man, I was over there the other day. We was tripping all over one another. There's so many people wanting to come help. Praise God. It's how do we love one another? How do we take care of those of us who has already taken care of people? I hope this puts things in perspective, and I hope this starts, kind of turning our mind away from the way the world tells us to think and toward what God says. I'll stop right there. Let's see. Stoney, why don't you lead us in prayer, brother? Dismiss us.